Right. Good morning, everyone. I think we are going to go ahead and get started. I know we have a few members that are running into a lot of traffic issues getting down to Annapolis. So there'll be some members that will still be filtering in. But in interest of time, because I think we do have a full agenda, even though we only have one audit that we're discussing this morning, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm Clarence Lamb, the Senate Chair of the Joint Audits and Evaluation Committee. Pleasure to be here. It's good to see members of the committee again, as well as our audit team and also the department. I'm going to turn it over to my co-chair, Delegate Solomon, to see if he has any additional opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And it's nice to be here with you all. This is my first official in-person chairing or co-chairing. And so just want to say it's a real honor to be appointed to this role, and an honor to be here with you all today, and just appreciate everybody here. I think we're gonna dig into an audit today that I know, or a topic that I know the committee's been working on for a while. And I just wanted to say, we appreciate the new MDH team being here. They were not left with an easy mess to clean up. But I think it's just really important to we're going to hear more from the auditors, but, we're looking at an agency in the previous administration that literally couldn't account for almost $3 billion worth of money, potentially may have lost tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on how everything sorts itself out, and seemingly blatantly flouted our procurement rules. Not small things, very serious issues. And I think for many of us, including this committee, that were, trying to be eagle-eyed on these issues over the last number of years, to see this in black and white, and to see the mess that the current administration is left with having to clean up, is just hard, and frankly really disappointing. So I just again want to thank the audits team, for the incredible work that they are doing, and that they're going to present on today. And with that, I am going to introduce the Office of Legislative Audits. I appreciate again the whole team being here, but we've got at the table Greg Hook, the chair and legislative auditor, Brian Tandon, the audit director, and Edward Rubenstein, the audit manager. And so I will turn it over to Greg and his team.
Co-chairs, members of the committee, for the record, I am Greg Hook, the legislative auditor, and Eddie Rubenstein to my immediate right, and Brian Tandon far right. This audit was a result of collective efforts of many OLA staff whose name appear on the back cover of the audit report, actually almost 20 auditors. And with your permission, I'd like to identify and have them stand up 4 who are here today who are not at the table. Josh Adler, the assistant audit director, Mark Katz, one of the audit seniors, Jim Podhorniak, another audit senior, and Rob Smith, the third audit senior. So we had a very large staff on this audit. OLA's presentation today will actually be in 2 parts. The first will be an overview of the financial related findings in the report, then a separate confidential briefing where I will call up to the table the OLA Information Systems audit team to discuss the report's cybersecurity related findings. Since this report contains a number of significant, sometimes complex findings that OLA staff will cover, my comments will essentially highlight the major elements of the first 4 slides in no particular order. And I believe you have the handouts on your computer or in paper. This audit report, dated October 19th, is over 50 pages long and contains 17 findings that are, 17 report findings. If there is a positive takeaway to be found in the large number of findings, it is that only 2 of those findings are repeats from the prior audit report. However, this report was also rated unsatisfactory in accordance with the OLA's longstanding JAEC approved rating policy, which means that the Office of Legislative Audits will perform a formal follow-up of this report at a later date, probably late spring or early summer 2024. The 17 findings were spread among 8 functional areas, which the OLA presentation will cover in depth. But I wanted to highlight that the 12 most significant findings exist in 4 areas: federal funds, budget and year-end closing, procurement and disbursements, and information security and controls. There are 5 findings related to federal funds or year-end budgetary closing, including problems with the completeness and accuracy of provider claim data on which the federal recoveries are based, untimely reconciliations of federal fund activity, a lack of comprehensive verification that all federal funds requested were received, and accounting issues with the account balance postings and MDH's automated fiscal year-end closing process. In some respects, several findings are an extension and further analysis of observations included in OLA's January 2023 special review of 2022 fiscal year and closing review. The systemic problems identified basically result in an inability to determine whether federal funds were recovered for all state expenditures, and the OLA presentation will mention some very large dollar amounts. We believe that it will require significant efforts by the department to resolve these audit issues. There are two procurement disbursement findings. The first is the use of an emergency contract that was originally awarded for COVID-19 related purposes, but is now ballooned to cost over $80 million and was used for unrelated services without adequate MDH oversight to ensure the services were received and payments made were proper. The second finding is a repeat from the prior report and speaks to MDH not always complying with state procurement regulations when procuring sole source and emergency contracts and publishing contract solicitations and awards in on the state's websites. There are 5 information system security control findings, which, as I mentioned, will be discussed in closed session. This treatment stems from State Government Article 2-1224I that stipulates that the OLA is to redact sensitive cybersecurity related findings from its publicly available audit reports. The other report findings are in accounts receivable, untimely billing of third-party insurers, payroll processing, cash receipts, internal control, and something of a new type of finding that going forward you might find in other OLA audits of various Office of the Secretaries in major departments. Most or all of these offices have internal or inspector general functions, including MDH, and OLA believes that the Office of the Secretary needs to ensure that OLA findings from other MDH audits were appropriately resolved and corrected. And that is a new finding you'll see in other Office of the Secretary audit reports. As you can see, there are a number of major issues that need to be addressed, and we believe it will require significant efforts on the part of MDH to resolve them. To that end, I would be remiss if I did not commend the current MDH administration for its positive responses to the findings and recommendations, and the Secretary's commitment to implementing appropriate corrective actions. With that, I will turn it over to Brian Tannen and Eddie to discuss the specifics of the non-cybersecurity audit report findings.
Good morning, co-chairs and members of the committee. My name is Eddie Rubenstein, and I was the manager for the MDH Office of the Secretary Audit. Eric, if we could start on slide 5, please. To help explain findings 1 through 5, I'd like to start on slide 5 by giving a brief overview of MDH's federal funds process. During fiscal year 22, MDH federal fund expenditures totaled $10.6 billion. Of this amount, $10.2 billion was expended by the Medical Care Programs Administration, or MCPA, the Behavioral Health Administration's Administrative Service Organization, the BHA-ASO, and the Developmental Disabilities Administration, or DDA. As shown in the table on the slide, these units' federal fund expenditures primarily related to 3 federal grants. The largest by far was Medicaid. Slide 6 summarizes MDH's 4-step federal fund accounting process. Step 1, MDH units pay providers for services rendered to individuals using state general funds and then record those payments in the state's Medicaid Management Information System, or MMIS. Step 2, every week, MDH requests reimbursement from the federal government based on those amounts. In addition, MDH is supposed to perform quarterly reconciliations to ensure that all payments were actually requested from the federal government. Step 3, the state treasurer credits funds received for these programs to a Medicaid clearing account maintained by MDH. And step 4, MDH must then allocate funds from that clearing account to the accounts where the related expenditures were recorded. MDH's allocation process is illustrated on slide 7. And I'll briefly explain it. The MDH units record expenditures in over 1,000 different accounts, which are represented by the rectangles on the right of the figure. Federal fund drawdowns for these expenditures are initially recorded in the Medicaid clearing account, as I just said, which is depicted by the oval on the bottom left. So MDH must then record journal entries to allocate the funds from that clearing account to the accounts where the expenditures are recorded. As I'm about to explain in findings 1 through 4, we found issues with all 4 steps of this process. As a result, there's a lack of assurance that MDH recovered all available federal funds, and untimely recoveries resulted in significant lost investment income to the state. Finding 1 relates to the first step in MDH's federal funds process, which is recording payments to providers. We found that MDH did not periodically compare these units' expenditures to the amounts recorded in MMIS. As a result, certain claims were not entered into MMIS, and therefore the related federal funds were not recovered. This condition has been noted in 4 of our last 5 DDA audit reports dating back to 2009. For example, our most recent DDA report noted 8.8 million was not recorded in MMIS, and MDH has since determined that these funds are no longer recoverable. As a result, state general funds will be needed to cover those expenditures. MDH also did not have procedures to ensure that units resolved claims that were rejected by MMIS. As noted in our October 2022 BHA ASO report, as of September 2021, BHA had unresolved denied claims totaling almost $107 million. These denied claims represent expenditures made using state general funds for which federal reimbursement has not yet been obtained. Even if MDH eventually recovers all these funds, the failure to obtain timely reimbursement will still result in lost interest to the state. Finding 2 on slide 9 relates to the second step of MDH's federal accounting process, which is requesting money from the federal government. We found that MDH did not ensure that critical quarterly reconciliations were performed to ensure that the amounts requested agreed to actual expenditures. As of August 2022, MDH had not conducted these reconciliations for a nearly 3-year period. We were advised that the employee who was performing the reconciliations left the state in December 2019, and the responsibility was never reassigned. As a result, MDH was unaware the reconciliations were not being performed until we inquired about it during our audit. After we brought this to their attention, MDH performed the missing reconciliations, which identified $973 million in additional federal funds that had not been previously requested. Although MDH subsequently recovered these funds, the untimely recovery resulted in lost investment income of $6.4 million. Finding 3 on slide 10 relates to the third step in the process, which is receiving money from the federal government. We found that MDH did not have procedures to ensure reimbursement requests were actually received. Although MDH advised that it verified the reimbursement requests were received for most of its federal grants, these verifications did not include the Medicaid, MCHIP, and MFP grants that collectively account for 96% of its federal fund expenditures. Given the significance of these grants, we believe MDH needs a procedure to ensure each reimbursement request is received. Finding 4 on slide 11 relates to the last step in MDH's federal fund accounting process, which is allocating federal revenue to the accounts where the related expenditures are recorded. We found that MDH did not have procedures to ensure these funds were properly allocated, and as a result, the funds were either not allocated or were allocated improperly. MDH allocated federal funds from the Medicaid clearing account without considering how much was available for distribution. For example, in May 22, MDH allocated $1.6 billion from the clearing account to eliminate deficit balances in the other expenditure accounts, even though the clearing account only had a balance of $124 million at that time. At the end of fiscal year 22, the clearing account had a $1.1 billion deficit balance. Since that account is only used to record revenues until they're allocated, it should never have a deficit balance. A deficit balance in this account means that MDH allocated more federal funds than the state actually received. MDH also did not ensure that federal revenue related to DDA, MCHIP, and MFP was properly allocated to offset state-funded provider payments. Specifically, we identified 3 accounts for these programs with surplus balances totaling $2.8 billion that had not been allocated to the related expenditure accounts. In addition, MDH did not update its allocation methodology to reflect changes in the DDA process, resulting in $301 million likely being allocated to other non-DDA accounts. The failure to properly allocate federal revenue resulted in a lack of assurance that any of the account balances are accurate, and MDH could not determine whether all federal funds were ultimately recovered. This is significant because It means that MDH cannot readily determine the extent to which longstanding deficit and surplus balances in certain accounts are related. As shown in the figure on slide 12, at fiscal 22 year end, 1/3 of MDH's account balances were identical to balances in one or more prior years dating back to 2015. For example, the first row of the chart shows 3 accounts with deficit balances of $49 million that have been carried forward at every fiscal year end since 2015. This means that one of 2 things happened. Either federal revenue was received but never allocated to those accounts, or MDH never actually requested reimbursement for the expenditures. If it's the first option, the complexity of the process and the duration of the issues I just described will make it very difficult to definitively determine whether that revenue or where that revenue was posted. If it's the second option, then it's likely too late to request reimbursement because MDH only has 2 years from the date of the expenditure to request the funds from the federal government. I'm now going to turn it over to Brian Tannen to discuss finding 5.
Good morning. For the record, Brian Tannen, I'm the Director of Compliance and Performance Audit Divisions. I'm here to discuss our budgetary year-end closing. Before I start, I'd just like to go over some of the ground rules that need to happen at the end of every year because they're important. Eddie just mentioned some pervasive failures with the federal funds in virtually every step of the process. Thankfully, at the end of each year, state government has a process, a closing process, where we're supposed to true up our records and confess our of sorts. When it comes to federal funds, the General Accounting Division requires all funds to close with a 0 balance. Now, how do you do that? As Eddie mentioned, we expend funds and then go back and collect it. All these accounts that Eddie just mentioned are different balances. So at the end of the year, if you have a negative balance, you need to book an accrued revenue. You need to record a receivable because it's if those funds are actually expected to be received from the federal government. If you have a surplus, you need to defer those funds, anticipating that those funds are going to be spent in future years. Now, the General Accounting Division there is a third option. If in fact you identify the fact that you have expenditures that are no longer recoverable from the federal government, you need to confess those and report those to GAD as unfunded liabilities. What happened, GAD has 2 rules for these entries. The first one is they need to be adequately supported. You book one of these accrued revenue transactions, there needs to be support for what that number represents. And the second criteria that they have is those funds should generally be received within 60 days of the close of the fiscal year. I gotta be honest, and I'll confess, before we looked at a single closing transaction, we knew the process was broken. How, you ask? The first is, Eddie pointed out, they had failed to recover 800 or 900 plus millions of dollars because they didn't do that one reconciliation. And the question puzzled our crew. How did that ever get past the year-end close? When they were booking those year-end receivables, didn't they realize that there was a sudden increase in the amount that they needed to accrue? The fact that they didn't catch it was indicative of the fact that there was a problem. That was the first thing. The second thing was, we looked at the numbers of the dollars that were being accrued. When you have $10.2 billion in accruals, which included $6.2 billion in receivables on an agency that only spends $10 billion a year, we knew there was a problem. There is no reason why an agency with a $10 billion annual budget should have $6 billion worth of receivables. And even if you were to take this from a very high level and net all the numbers, you still ended up with a $2.2 billion deficit at the end of the year. How does that make sense? Eddie just explained they draw down funds on a weekly basis. So we knew before we looked at a single transaction that things were broken. So let's talk about how they did book those transactions that year. And because I will tell you this, at the end of the year, all these funds, all 1,250 or so accounts closed at 0. How did that happen? They had an automated script. And you could find this in the report, but basically the script looked at how much money did we spend? How much money did we get in? What is our balance? If there was a negative balance, that exact amount was booked as a receivable. If there was a positive balance, they booked it as a negative receivable, essentially pushed that balance into the next year. And that's what they did year after year. And that's why deficits that Eddie identified going back as 2015 kept getting rolled forward year after year. So the question is, do I have a problem with that script? I don't. I just told you, GAD told them they have to close at zero. Our problem here deals with what happened after they ran the script. Did they take the time to look at an account, and even at face value, anyone looking at those receivables in its totality should have said, something is wrong. There's a problem here with these balances. How could these numbers be so high? And that is what we're here to talk about today. But when we started looking and delving into some of those numbers, we saw some very scary things. And that's the best way I could describe it. One was some of these accrued revenue entries were identical year after year after year, significant numbers. The other thing that, and Eddie pointed out, was we were seeing deficit balances and therefore receivables being booked in accounts that had no expenditure activity. How does that happen? If the account is just being used to hold revenue until it gets moved someplace else, it should never need an accrued revenue or receivable for those funds. And so we're left with this challenge. And the question has been posed to us by a number of people, is there a deficit? So the department has maintained, and they say, you're right, there are huge negative balances in some of these accounts. There's a clearing account with over $1 billion deficit in it, but there are also a lot of accounts with positive numbers. The problem is that there is no documentation to explain how those positive balances and negative balances relate. And the details in this are very, very important. When you're dealing with 1,200 accounts, dealing with multiple federal grants and multiple federal grant years, it's not enough to say we have a lot of money coming in every year. It's not enough to say we have surplus balances in these accounts that probably relate to these negative balances. You can't function like that. And the spout, it's if I had to say, if we have to fix it, the best analogy would be you have a pipe leaking in your house, but the water keeps running, and you've got to fix this problem with a consistent flow of money coming through. And I think the reason that this was allowed to occur for so many years is because we have a robust process where we ask for a lot of federal money, and the federal government continuously gives us that money, and hopefully that's going to continue. But it doesn't negate the fact that at end of the year, it's our time to fess up and identify funds that are no longer available and whether or not we actually have a deficit. So I'm going to get back to my question. Do we have a deficit? Well, I can tell you right now, just from what Eddie said, the department acknowledged that 8.8 million or so from DDA that they never requested is no longer available. Based on the math and the way they did that calculation, that 8.8 million would have been in one of these receivables that I just talked about. So the answer is yes, that amount is a deficit that will need to be bailed out by the state's general fund. I could point to that, but we had much bigger numbers. We have billions. And my answer, and the thing that I can testify today is, I can't tell you. The magnitude of the problems that Eddie pointed out in the way they're managing their federal funds precludes us from saying definitively, I'll be honest with you, whether or not there is a deficit, I feel comfortable at least with that 8.8 million, but the amount of the deficit, I don't feel comfortable saying anything. But what I can tell you is based on the lack of documentation that they were able to provide us during and subsequent to our audit, they cannot come to this table and tell you definitively that there is not. It's a process, and the department has committed and they've agreed to this finding, and they're working and they're making some meaningful strides to establish procedures to identify it. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take a long time until they're able to unravel some of these things going forward to identify whether or not there is a deficit. I can tell you that as we stand here today, OLA has an audit team looking at the 2023 closeout, and we are looking at some of those transactions. I'm not in a position to discuss the status of those today, but we will be reporting on those transactions sometimes in January. With that, I'll turn it back over to Eddie.
Thank you for the audition for the GAD director's job. That was well done. Okay, Eddie.
If I may, moving on to slide 14, finding 6 was that MDH used an emergency contract for unrelated services and did not sufficiently document that the services were received and the payments were proper. In January 2021, MDH awarded a $3.8 million emergency contract for consulting services related to the state's COVID-19 vaccine program. The contract required the vendor to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the program and to provide staff as needed to implement the vendor's recommendations. During the rest of that year, MDH processed 4 modifications, which collectively increased the cost of the contract by $83 million. Specifically, in April 2021, MDH processed a modification that extended the term by 6 months and increased the cost by 21 million. In August, they processed a second modification to extend the term and add another $22 million. In November, MDH retroactively altered the scope of the contract to include additional services that were unrelated to the program. And then finally, in December of 2021, MDH extended the term another 6 months and added $40 million to the contract, which included money for services related to the network security incident from December 2021. Activity under the contract through April of that year was reviewed during our special review of emergency COVID procurements. In that report, we concluded that MDH lacked documentation to justify the initial contract and the first modification. We also concluded that MDH did not adequately monitor the vendor and verify the propriety of the related payments. Our current audit focused on the August, November, and December modifications and payments made since April of 2021. What we found was that MDH could not justify these 3 modifications either. Specifically, they could not explain why separate procurements were not issued for the two modifications that added additional services, given that they seemed so unrelated to the initial purpose of the contract. MDH also could not explain how it calculated the $62 million price tag associated with the August and December modifications. While MDH advised that it added funds to carry the contract through the extended period based on the average monthly spend, it could not document how this amount was calculated. Furthermore, the modifications did not specify the number of vendor staff that were to be provided and the services they were to perform. This is significant because the number of staff increased from 7 employees on the initial contract to as many as 138 throughout the contract, and billings for these people's services accounted for virtually all of the contract costs. We also found a pervasive lack of documentation to support that MDH had requested, reviewed, and approved the work the vendor was performing. MDH advised that it held weekly meetings with the vendor during which it assigned work and reviewed the vendor's progress. However, MDH could not document the specific tasks that were assigned and the number of employees that were approved to perform the work. MDH also did not obtain detailed statements of work for each vendor employee as required by the contract. In this regard, our review of all 57 invoices totaling $62 million that were paid between April 2021 and October 22 disclosed that none of the invoices contained these statements of work or any other documentation that MDH could use to independently determine the propriety of the amounts billed. As a result, MDH lacked assurance that the billings were reasonable in relation to the services that were provided. In its response to our report, MDH did commit to conducting a review of the contract, which is going to include making a determination of whether amounts charged were sufficiently documented and if those can be associated with specific assignments. Moving on to slides 15 and 16 are our other financial related findings. These findings related to procurements and disbursements, accounts receivable for services rendered at MDH inpatient facilities, payroll, cash receipts, and ensuring that appropriate corrective actions were taken to address findings from our fiscal compliance audits of other MDH units. Our report also contains 5 cybersecurity related findings that will be discussed during the closed session, as Greg said. And finally, on slide 18 are our conclusions, which are recommendations MDH should implement. This concludes our presentation on the fiscal related findings, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you to your team and for a very comprehensive overview of the audit. I'll kick it off with a question to begin with. It sounds as though this audit that you conducted that came up with the several billion-dollar mark was really an audit of just 16 accounts. Is that right? Was it a sampling of what you believed were this was a subset of what you believe were all the audits that could, all the accounts that could have a problem?
So initially, it started with the closeout, the fiscal 22 closeout special review that we did, which was issued in January of this year. Did you want to jump in? No. That audit, we tested 16 specific transactions, which would be 16 of those 1,200 or so accounts. What this audit report represents is based on concerns we identified during that special review. We zoomed out and looked at the entire federal fund process from the point of making the expenditure to getting the money from the federal government to how do we account for that? And what those figures in the report represent is an analysis of all MDH accounts, not just those 16.
Got it. Okay. And are you aware if the department has reached out to the state auditor's office for any follow-up?
I'm not aware.
Okay. And then last question for Mr. Tannen, then I know you're pretty comprehensive on what you were describing. What should we be asking then if we wanted to get a fuller handle of what that deficit would be? Like for us to, as a state, what are those questions that we need answered to be able to have a full answer here of the deficit that we could be facing out of this?
So I think the first thing is time. It's gonna, as we mentioned, the problems are pervasive. And so the underlying structure is very, very poor. And in order to figure out what's going on, I think the first thing that needs to happen, and I think the department is working on that, is shoring up some of those procedures to make sure going forward, we're actually keeping track of, this is what we spent, this is what we requested, this is what we received. And once those mechanics are in place, and at year end, you can accurately point to those numbers, you're going to be able to compare that information to what the actual balances are in those accounts. And then you're going to have a question. If this is the amount that you identified as being current, then what is the rest of this balance? And where is that money coming from? And is it even available anymore? But at the time that we did our audit, and as I sit here today, that detail and that level of accuracy was not available. And so pointing to the 16 that you brought up, at any given point, they have enough money to pay for those 16 that we happen to select. So if they come to the table and say, we resolved those 16, I could have resolved that 16 very easily. They had funds in their accounts at that time and in other accounts that they could have eliminated the 16 items that we tested. The question was, how did you know that the balance is there related to those 16? And how do we know what other expenditures are still remaining that don't have a pile of money available to cover it up? And as I said, it's just going to take some time. They're going to implement some procedures, hopefully, that will allow them to go and have a better understanding of the numbers that are showing up at the end of the year. And through that mechanism, they're going to be able to identify what, in fact, is not accounted for.
But it's a twofold problem, right? So you have to retrospectively go back and do all the back accounting for that. But then prospectively, you have to make sure that there's a process in place to make sure that this would not happen again in the future with all the accounts that you have.
So there's a challenge. If we were dealing with a problem that happened in 2023, I'd say, yeah, let's do an analysis of what happened in 2023. But Eddie pointed out with the federal funds, this is a problem going back year after year after year. And the problems, the account balances based on the irregularities that he identified in his federal fund analysis, make every single balance suspect. So at this point, to go back and look at, I would argue, millions of transactions that resulted in these fund balances, I don't think that's effective, nor I'm not confident that they'll be able to, pinpoint what happened back in 2015. I think at some point the decision is going to have to be made to first and foremost, let's correct the process to make sure we could account forward. And then through that mechanism, see where we stand at the next close once those procedures are in place. To go back and try to dig back into the transactions, Eddie's showing revenue coming out that exceeds the balances in those accounts. There are expenditure accounts which were not discussed here that also come into play. There are a lot of activity that accumulate over a 5-year period. To go back and try to figure out each one of those transactions, I think would be an exercise in futility at this point. So I think really the point is, let's focus in on what we do know at the end of 2023 or at the end of 2024. And then we look at the ones that we don't know. And that's where we could be critical on those balances.
And those that we don't know, after setting up a good process going forward, the state may have to take as a loss.
To the extent that there are no federal funds available to cover them, yeah.
Right. Okay, thank you. You want me to start with that?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. We'll start with Senator Hester.
Thank you very much. This is obviously concerning overall. I do have just a few process questions, just trying to understand how what you've identified might relate to other agencies. And so there's obviously an accounting problem, a procurement problem with MDH. Do you think that this is, is it just an MDH problem, or is it like agency wide? That's my first question. My second question is, would we have caught this earlier and been able to go back and get the federal funds had we been doing more frequent audits? And my third question is about the automated script that you mentioned. Was that an automated script in Excel, in a piece of software? Was it artificial intelligence? I mean, because I'm just curious, with the 529 fiasco, there was an automated decision also. And so like, it's just concerning that we may not have the appropriate human oversight, you know, in this case, the employee left to adequately track the decisions that are being made.
I'll keep the first two. The answer to the first question, the current closeout that Brian referred to, the review process, we are focusing on the health department again and two other large agencies, generally funded agencies, and we're going to give them putting them the same microscope we put MDH under. So we'll find out if it's happening elsewhere or if it's just at MDH with the current closeout. And that's all the closeout's going to do this year. It's 3 agencies and that's it. We used to do a much more broad, high level review. And now we're just going to dig down at 3 agencies and look at these type of transactions. So we'll let you know sometime in January if it's just confined to MDH or if other agencies have a similar problem. That's the first answer. The second answer, I take the blame. We should have found this several years ago. When we did our closeout review, we took a broad level view. We should have gone deeper, and we've learned from it from last year, and that's what we're going to do going forward. We're going to take a deeper dive. So I take the full blame for the fact this wasn't discovered last year or the year before. I have a sign, I have Harry Truman sign on my desk. The buck stops here, and it does. And it was my fault, but we've learned from it, and we're going to make sure going forward we do this right. The third question.
So it's not that complicated. No, it's not an Excel formula. It's a pretty straightforward formula. And you don't even need a calculator to do it. You could look at the year-end balances at the end of each year and say that amount needs to get to 0. It's basic math. And that is what the calculation did. It looked at the balance. If it was a positive number, they booked a negative number to bring it down to 0. If there was a deficit, they booked a positive number, a receivable, to bring it up to 0. That is all the formula did. It really was just mechanics. And there was really no problem with that because they do need to get to 0. What was missing was each one of those transactions needed to be scrutinized. They needed to look at, hey, wait a second, the automatic script just booked $1 billion receivable in a clearing account that has no expenditures. What is going on? That is the question that wasn't asked. And my job, the buck stops with Greg, as he said, my job is to defend Greg. I'm going to say our closeout procedures really were predicated on some long-standing procedural controls that existed at the health department over the years. And I think what you're seeing is, a breakdown in the last 5 years or so, maybe towards the tail end of our last audit or so around then, and it's just coming to roost today.
So the person that left, who was supposed to be looking at that basic formula and asking why it didn't make sense, like
that person was responsible for doing the reconciliation.
And that's the person that left in 2019.
Yes.
Correct.
And that person was not rehired, and that should go back on the secretary of the agency.
The problem is twofold. One, they need to have procedures to explain what that person was doing, and they need procedures to make sure that that procedure is being done regardless of the person who's sitting in that chair. And that's what happened. The person left, but there wasn't a procedure, a checklist or something. These are the tasks that need to be done monthly that identify it. But I'll say, even if they didn't have that, that is what the closeout is for. And that's why it's important. At the end of the year, it should have been identified if they were closing their books in accordance with GAD practices.
So thank you. And just to emphasizing what Senator Hester's point was there at the end. And I want to thank Mr. Hook for the acknowledgement as well. This is ultimately the department's responsibility. OLA is coming in as a check, as the auditors, to make sure that everything that had taken place was proper. First and foremost, the responsibility lies with the department to make sure that their practices and the structure that they have for accounting is in accordance with general standards. And so while, I think the OLA is coming in as a follow-up, I think it's incumbent to bear in mind that ultimately the department was primarily responsible for all of this. And remember that we were working with a department that was very opaque about their practices.
There we go. I want to get to the House members, but I just want to pick up on a thread because the one question that I had is, so to further emphasize Senator Lamb and Senator Hester's point. So the Department of Health has a contracted auditing firm, right? That's supposed to essentially internally look at their books for them. Is that correct?
Well, the states has sort of financial statements, and the auditor that does the state's financial statements must spend some time at the health department looking at the records. Yes.
Okay, so I guess my question is, in your review, what should have happened with the state auditors or the contracted firm that we bring in at the end of every year with the Department of Health?
I don't know what discussions occurred with that firm and with the health department or with GAD. I have no idea. They do not generally consult with us as part of their audit. They are completely independent. So I couldn't even venture a guess as to what transpired between the parties.
Okay. Yeah, I think, again, to Senator Lamb's point, there should have been, I think we need to have a broader conversation about what the firm that we contract with is doing on this, that somehow they didn't catch this egregious issue. Delegate Arentz, I think I saw your light on first.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I think I'm on now. Mr. Hook, I appreciate it. And I think I have a little bit of a mantra I go through on some of these hearings, but I will give you some credit for this because one of the things we do look at is we've seen this department several times over the last several years on these audits. And as the chairman mentioned, we've had answers that we don't really get the answers we want or that are satisfactory. I would agree it is a departmental failure, but when I start looking at something like this is a business. I mean, these are real departments that don't just have a secretary. Isn't the end all. It isn't the secretary necessarily, although I think there are some areas where they should be pushing it. We have a whole system failure here. I mean, there are checks and balances as any business or any department that sit back and said 1 + 1 at the end of the day has to equal 2. And we're looking at billions of dollars in issues that are not being met month to month, let alone day to day or year to year. And I sit back and say that who's running anything in there and what are we doing the whole department wide that these errors can continually happen and no one's taking responsibility. There's no accountability at any level, apparently, to start looking at billions of dollars not being done. Do we have a bigger problem? And I hammer on this thing about accountability a lot. And is there something you all could suggest or we all should be suggesting that these metrics be put in place that this can't possibly happen? A lot of people don't understand what $1 billion is. It's huge. And when we start looking at our deficits and what we're facing as a state, we can't afford $6.4 million in lost interest. We have no idea if that's even accurate. And when you get the money, if you get the money on month 1 versus month 12, it's a big difference in interest. So I would like to see something, even with the next set of secretary coming in. I mean, I don't see how you manage this without a process. And to allude that there are no processes in place means that this department has been totally mismanaged for decades if we don't have those metrics set in place today. How do we fix that?
It's documenting why do you do something and when do you. A lot of the state agencies, I think, probably lack manuals that explain what has to be done and why it has to be done. And there needs to be an understanding on the part of the state employees who are doing it, why they are doing something and why it's so important that it be done. There was an audit years ago. We used to do a quick story years ago when I first started here back in 1980. It was actually 1 year after I started, it was 82. We were doing the Mass Transit Administration and we did their audited financial statements back then. They actually had operating statistics they reported to WMATA, to the federal government. And so I went up to their accounting person who was doing their closeout entries for their processes. And I said, well, what closeout entries are you going to process for your accounts? He went into his desk drawer. He pulled out a four column piece of paper that had been prepared by the prior legislative auditor 2 years earlier. He said, these are my entries. He didn't know why he was doing those. He was just told he had to do those. So what you need are qualified staff that understand how to do things and why they're doing it. And what happens many times is somebody leaves and they don't understand. So the replacement nothing's in writing. They don't understand what the person used to do. Oh, there's automated scripts. Oh, we just run the automated scripts and they all balance out. Hey, we're good. But they don't understand why that's important and how that has to be done and what you do with the information. So that's really what the problem is. The problem is people understanding what their job is. And that transfer of knowledge, I think many times is not happening at state agencies. So you have all these vacancies. When you fill a vacancy, okay, well, this was Bill's job. What did Bill do? I don't know. He got this report every month and he did something with it. Well, woe betide the person that takes that job. So I think the department has agreed to bring in a CPA firm to help them develop processes going forward that their employees will understand when they do closing, why they're doing it that way and why it's so important.
But in every audit we've gone through, we've talked about staff, we've talked about training, and every audit that we go through, we're still talking about reinventing that and somehow having that. I would think that by this time, those processes would be in place. People would have this, here's your job description. And I just find it very difficult to put these kind of numbers in my head that everybody in this department has been complicit. Not everybody, but I'm making a general statement. But when you're off billions of dollars, there is some sort of, I don't know, who's running this show? And even if there are department heads that are running this, are you suggesting that every department head needs to be retrained? Every person needs to be retrained? Is that where we're going with this?
I think a lot of the operational staff really need to understand why they do what their job is and why they do it and why it's so important. We don't usually test and look for procedure manuals when we do our audits. Our work papers become the procedures. We actually obtain a very thorough understanding of the agency's processes. And I used to say years ago that I bet our work papers are a better record of what happens at a state agency than the state agencies themselves have in writing.
And I understand that, but I'm saying, is there something we should be doing to sit back and say that your work papers are now the law? Because we're running into the same problem over and over and over and over again, and we're not able to address it. And to summarily write off this kind of dollars to sit back and say we'll never see it. I mean, I'm a taxpayer. I pay a lot of taxes, and I sit back and say, is this how we're really properly spending my money? What more can we do, and what more can we do as a committee to ensure that these things, that our questions are answered and our suggestions are taken in place? I've been in audits where we've asked people for information. They say, we don't do that, and we let it go. I think we need some more meat in what we can do and what we are asking, what we're demanding. I mean, we're responsible for this. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for letting me rant.
I think the next delegate that I saw is Delegate Harrison.
Thank you. So I guess we're probably all saying pretty much the same thing. And the first question that I wrote down was about qualifications. And honestly, well, first of all, this sounds really like it's a personnel matter, personnel problem, I would say. Are the individuals, those who are responsible for the financial part of this, are they even qualified to do what they're doing? You don't have to answer that, but that's a question, because I would question. Now, I'm not an auditor, I'm not an accountant. My husband is, so I don't even do checkbooks, but but what I do know is that you do need to account for the people's money, and every single employee of the state of Maryland needs to understand that they are responsible to the people. It's not just us who are elected, it's each and every one of us. And this is the people's money that we're talking about. And what's even more distressing is that as we talk about the DDA and specifically, those are people who really, really need us, and they need what's coming in. And for us to be somewhat lackadaisical in dealing with the money that needs to go to them for their problems, for their issues, for their resources. And we're not being responsible over that. It's a real problem because those people need us. So I think that really, honestly, this is a personnel issue and it needs to be handled as such, along with the recommendations, which leads me to my next question is, so what are the consequences? This has been an ongoing issue. You said that these have been the findings over and over again. At what point, as Delegate Aaron said, are there going to be consequences? What teeth are we going to have? Do we need to, in private industry, they'll dock your pay. Does the secretary's pay need to be docked? I don't know. The department, we can't take the money from the people, but those who are responsible for these processes need to, there need to be some consequences if they're not going to perform as they should. Is this, I think that we really need to come up with some consequences, honestly. And then finally, should the treasurer's office or the comptroller's office need to be involved since they are the money keepers of the state?
I don't. The closing transactions that we talked about today go to the comptroller's office. It goes to general accounting division, but they're not in a position. I can't underestimate the complexity of the federal fund process. And there's a difference between the procurement findings Eddie talked about. That's procurement 101, failures at every point. The other ones, the ones that dealing with these federal funds, it's a dynamic process. Every year, the rules change for a lot of these programs. We create new programs. We change the funding mechanisms. So it is a complicated process. And that's why those procedures become so important. It's not static. Every year, there are changes at the federal level, at the state level that need to be incorporated into those procedures. And so, getting back to your thing, you do need to have the right people and the right procedures in place to make sure that those things happen seamlessly.
Well, it's very heartbreaking, honestly, as we deal with this, especially as we talk about these particular issues with the DDA and the amount of money and the people who really need those services and those resources. I can't express enough how disturbing that really is. And I'm hoping that we will come up with, now we're legislators, we don't run the day-to-day operations of the government. But I think that we need to do something to ensure that this does not continue to happen. And the next time that there needs to be some serious consequences behind it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Harrison. I just wanted to say one thing real quick before we move on. If you look in the audit, to Delegate Aarons's point and to Delegate Harrison's point about personnel, there's a almost 14% vacancy rate just in the secretary's office. So when we talk about personnel, there's a reason why our governor and the speaker and the Senate president have made filling these positions a top priority. But this is something that's clearly been going on for a long time. And we know the previous administration did not fill or choose to invest in staff. And I think you can't divorce that from any of these conversations. If you don't have the people, if you don't pay them appropriately, if you don't value them appropriately, we don't fill the positions. The other thing I'd just like to point out, we do unfortunately have a hard stop in the physical space at 11:30. So we also still have the Department of Health and obviously the discussion around the IT. So I don't want to end anybody's questions, but I do just want to ask, consider we will have an opportunity to talk directly to the secretary, to question the secretary and her team. But with that, I think the next person that I saw on the list with their light on was Delegate Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll give you my questions all at once. Did outdated software contribute at all to this problem? Are there systems, computer systems that would have caught this that we haven't updated, similar to, for example, the treasurer's office and the comptroller's office, the problems we heard about there? Is there software that we don't have that we should have that would have caught this? That's number one. Number two, you've talked about the people problem, but this seems to go on years back. So it sounds like it's more of a process problem. And as others have mentioned, do we need to legislate that departments have procedural manuals? That's another question. And final question is the 8.8 million that you're suggesting must be bailed out by the state's general fund. When does that happen? Does that happen in this upcoming fiscal year or is it in this current fiscal year? Those are my three questions. Thank you.
All right, starting off with the system, the department could speak to the specifics about the age and antiquity of their computer system. I think we've had hearings about the replacement or attempt to replace that system over the years. But I want to be clear, the flags were there that should have identified the problems. Because of the dollar amounts involved, they should have been able with the existing software to recognize that there was a progress just by looking at the balances at year end. They were red flag. Yes, enhanced systems would be great and help improve especially when going forward in the process for allocating these funds, having a more robust system that could do that, it would probably be beneficial to them. The department would be better to address that. But I want to be clear, the problems that we identified, the numbers at the end of the year should have been enough to raise the flag for them to identify them. I can't remember the next two questions.
Well, the 8.8, I remember that one.
The 8.8 is something that the department has acknowledged that is no longer available. And the problem that you have is, it's not a problem, because of the influx of ongoing federal funds that come in, you're not seeing it. So the department could address whether or not they were going to disclose that as an unfunded liability as part of their 2023 close. And if that's the case, then, or if they're going to come up with some other way within their department to offset those funds.
Okay, but you did say, or someone did say that it must be bailed out by the state's general fund.
If the federal funds are not available, the only
Okay.
other option to cover those costs would be general.
Thank you. And then the last question was about, you've been here apparently a long time on the audits. Do you feel as though the legislature needs to mandate these procedure manuals be in place?
I
No,
hate
it's a
to-
serious, listen,
I hate to call somebody out, but there's somebody here from Department of Budget and Management, and it's an audit compliance unit they have. And it's staffed by many ex-Office of Legislative Audit employees. And they work with a lot of inspector generals, internal auditors at all the very large departments, and they have meetings periodically. I think that might be the venue possibly to start, is have the executive branch through DBM check and take an inventory of the proper procedures and then see what they come up with first. I mean, they're very qualified to do that. It's just that
I
they
can
have the time
appreciate,
enough.
I can appreciate that answer, but the reality is this is a very serious problem and we didn't get here overnight. And it may require a more stronger response by the legislature. So that'll be something, I guess, that we discuss, but thank you for your answer.
And to your point, Delegate Watson, I think somewhere in the report, I can't find the exact page reference, but there is an Office of Inspector General for the Health Department now, but they didn't start until I think it was July 1st of 2022. So
Oh, no,
after.
no, they've had years and years.
Oh, well, then maybe it was a creation of a new
Yes,
position.
that's what it was.
Okay, but they didn't start until after the audit period was finished. So I think who do I have next on my list here? Delegate Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one can't help but leave this presentation thinking there are aspects of these books that are fake. I think that's one clear implication of this. And so at least with respect to this business of the year-end balances and entries being identical to numbers dating back years, you're going back to 2015, and I'm really wondering how long this problem actually exists. Is it 2015 because it goes back to 2015? And part of my question about that is there something that went wrong in the transition process between gubernatorial administrations, and that's another potential point where some of this could be addressed.
So as far as how far back it goes, 2015 is as far as our office has good data from the state's financial records. So it's possible there's more stuff beyond that. I think based on what we were seeing, it seems likely that it started around then. I'm not aware of any like change in administration that would have an impact on that.
Yeah, well, it gets sort of at Delegate Watson's question about, if we're trying to troubleshoot this, at least certain places where there could be a reminder other than a Google Calendar entry that says, hey, idiot, reconcile the books. or do the invoices, whatever, you know, I mean, save for something like that, process wise, if it is 2015, I mean, that date jumped out at me, because I'm like, right, Hogan and me and many of my colleagues here were sworn in January 2015, and we appear to be looking at a period that is 2 gubernatorial terms from 2015 to 2022. We're at a juncture now early in the next gubernatorial transition where it seems we've caught this. But if some of the problem happened in the handover between the O'Malley and Hogan administrations, and something about the transition between agency chiefs could have been a point to catch this, I do wonder, it is getting at this whole fundamentals question that we're talking about. How the hell does one, excuse my language, how the heck does one transfer this knowledge and then make sure it's re-upped? Not by catching it at an audit that happens years after the fact, potentially, when we can't do anything about it. But I am curious how much we can trace back to that 2015 point in time, and whether there's something that could have been done there.
Well, I guess as Brian said, there's 2 parts to the closeout. The first is that the account has to close at 0, and GAD mandates that. What was missing here is then that scrutiny of what was the transaction that they booked, and there wasn't really a mechanism to force that to happen. And I think beyond any specific person or administration or anything like that, I think there's just been a long-standing attitude of, we get a lot of federal money, to Brian's analogy of the pipe flowing, that
Right. No one ever catches
a
it.
small leak.
As long as the federal government doesn't shut down, this may never catch up with us if our fund balance is rotating in and out off, with big enough numbers, sure. But I guess very specifically, if you could clarify this, do the books stop being funny looking in 2014? Like the numbers start being different from every other year?
I think I would be speculating. The magnitude certainly increases at that point. And that's why I think it started around that time, but I can't with any specificity say exactly when.
Okay, thank you.
I think the next person I had on my list was Delegate Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you. I know I came in a few minutes late. It feels like I walked into a bit of a fiscal horror show when I walked in. I was like, what is going on? And so I do know kind of the overarching problems, and thank you for the details you provided. When I was looking at the conclusions, and I assume this is really obviously a big summary page of more specific recommendations, but I was curious particularly because, you mentioned you'd been here for quite a while. Are there states that have other policies around this for agencies that perhaps we should be looking to, or model kind of procedures for agencies to follow? I didn't know, because I feel like oftentimes we're looking to other states to kind of kind of check, if we're on pace for various, efforts. And I wondered in this regard, are there other states we would even look to for kind of the models? Because I feel like if you ask someone to establish these tools and procedures, but they lack the capacity to even execute your recommendations, I'm just concerned, kind of as a twofold question. Are there some model states around how they handle this and model policies and procedures? And then also, do you believe within the scope of personnel, should there be different attributes we're seeking or skills we're seeking in people that carry out this function despite the vacancy rate?
I think the second question is, maybe there should be a different skill set than what's currently there for some of the fiscal people within the state government. I think also we don't have any hard data on this, but we've talked amongst ourselves for a number of years, a salary question of what's fair compensation. If you want to get a qualified person, it may cost more than $90,000 to get I don't know what the fiscal person makes in the health department, but it's a $10 billion agency. And if you were running a $10 billion company, the fiscal person probably makes a lot more than the state employee makes doing that job. So it's not just the vacancies, it's not a quantity issue necessarily. It could also be a quality issue of paying for quality people and giving them a good salary. So that could be part of the issue. Other states, I'm a member of the National State Auditors Association. There's over 50 some, because there's Puerto Rico, there's Guam, there's a whole bunch of other ones, and they all do it. Every state is different. I've talked to them. I have some friends there. Some of the state auditors actually do the financial statements. I don't want that. I'm not saying I do not want that. But some states actually, the auditors do the financial statements. And so they have certain processes. They probably take more care than maybe, again, I can't even say that because I don't know, but
Right.
you know, when you have a profit motive with a CPA firm versus a government agency, but then some of the state auditors bill for it, some have it in their budget. So everybody is different. I don't know if we could find any kind of consistency amongst the other state auditors regarding the processes and the documentation of the processes.
Thank you. I do just I want to give credit to Senator Heddleman. It was actually your bill with now our U.S. Attorney, then Delegate Barron, to create the office to essentially create an independent office of Inspector General for Health. I do just want to point out, I'm kind of amused by this. So I went back and looked at the bill file. This was in the 2021 session. This is a letter from the Department of Health, basically saying that creating an independent office of the Inspector General will cripple the ability of the department to ensure transparency and oversight over virtually all of the department's operations. So I think to piggyback off the majority leader's point here, we tried to fix it, and clearly the department in the previous administration had no interest in doing that. And again, this office took effect July 1st of 2022. So after the audit period resolved itself, and I imagine the new administration, as I'm sure they'll talk about, is hopefully working hand in glove with them to try to fix these problems going forward. But that line in particular in their testimony is just a little galling looking at it in the context we're here today on. I think
You have to get, in all fairness to the department, they've had internal auditor and Inspector General office for many years, but the person reported to the secretary. So the independent aspect is the unique function, is that now they're independent of the secretary. But they have had, I mean, and we've dealt with them on many different things, but that office, I don't know how large it is, maybe it should be larger than it really is right now, but they have local health departments they monitor. They have a very large job too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just, you know, they have a giant department with numerous administrations, and it's not easy.
Well, and your point about bringing in good personnel and paying them appropriately is spot on. Delegate Johnson. And then I think we're going to close it at least on the House side so that we have time to get to the other witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The end of the year audit done by the state, do you know if the Department of Health gets a copy of that audit or a report on that audit?
It's the controller, I think, has the contract for the firm that does the state audit. And it's our consolidated financial reports. And they also do a single audit on federal funds, usually the same audit company. It's a very large document. There are probably certain aspects that deal with the health department, and there may be management findings, what they call management letter, where you have certain issues the auditor have with how processes work, and they may get communicated and probably will get communicated to the various departments. So there may be some knowledge on the part of the department for the findings from that annual audit. Yes, that's the short answer is yes. The long answer is what I just gave you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Johnson. We have Senator Heddleman, followed by Senator Benson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for all of your work over the years. I want to follow up a little bit on what Delegate Moon was talking about in terms of structural changes, if you can identify any that happened between prior to 14 and after 14, 1. And 2, the one word, and granted, I was a little bit late too, but the one word I have not heard today at all is COVID. And that is something that the prior administration had identified as perhaps one of the reasons that, you know, we were in a time of emergency. This department was hit upon like no other. Millions of dollars were coming in. They needed to respond. But I have not heard you identify that as a reason for anything that is contained in this report.
I wouldn't think for annual closeout processes, COVID would be relevant.
Okay.
Unless your employees were sick for a month and couldn't work, but I don't think it's relevant.
So this is a structural.
And to the credit of the
Massive.
current administration, they haven't said it. When it came to this activity, and we've had that with other audit reports where they talked about COVID.
Right.
That is not what the current administration, and to their credit, they've already reached, almost immediately, they reached out to DBM, recognizing that it's going to take, you know, a lot of resources to go and address the magnitude of the problems here. So I think they're better at addressing those specifics, but we didn't see that being obviously some of the funding increased, but
That doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about today.
Nope.
Thank you.
Senator Benson.
Yes, on page number 3 of the overview. And on page 3, finding 2, could you all comment on that? And that seems to me where the real problem is. Page 3, finding 2.
That's the finding where an employee, it was a vacancy. The employee that did that left state service or left the health department, and they were not replaced for how long, Eddie?
Almost 3 years.
Almost 3 years. And that's what that person did was a reconciliation that would have ensured that this money was recovered.
Wow. Okay. I wanted to be clear on that.
And they have the process in place to do it. Once we brought it to their attention, it did not take very long for them to run the numbers. Now, thankfully, they could have come back and said, thank you very much, we'll get to it. But they didn't. And they did the reconciliation shortly thereafter, thankfully, and very quickly recognized that, came up and identified that, cumulatively the funds were this amount and, submitted, requests for those funds and have since recovered it. But that is a very small piece of the systemic problem that we identified.
Say that.
Big number associated with it, but it's a very small piece of the problem in the scheme of issues that they need to correct.
It's also the simplest piece.
Yeah.
That's literally the simplest problem.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Benson. Second bite at the apple, Senator Hester, briefly.
I realize we're short on time, so you can take this offline, but I was curious, one, do we have any kind of awareness of the level of risk that the people in the agency, the staff in the agencies, carry? Like, is there any kind of risk, like register or like accountability? Like, could you tell me that like this 10% of our staff employees, have either a risk related to finance or the environment or cybersecurity?
I'm unaware of any.
Because what I was thinking is if we knew who carried a lot of risk, it would be fabulous to have an acknowledgement of whether that position was open or filled or vacant. Because while we've identified this one simple thing, this person left in 2019, we actually don't know out of the 5,000 positions or whatever it is that are open, which ones carry high levels of risk.
I think that would be a good question for the department, but I do think over the past 5 to 10 years, a lot of the history, some longstanding employees have left. And that history came with a lot of knowledge about these individual programs and an ability to go make sure the key things were working. I think the department could probably better address, some of those positions.
All right, thank you, Senator Hester. I do want to ask the auditors just to think carefully about whether there does need to be further procedures or manuals that maybe we need to put in statute. To Delegate Watson's point earlier, I think it's a very scary thought that your work papers are becoming the manual.
Well, that's what we've always said amongst ourselves.
Okay.
We have a big head, but that's what we said amongst ourselves. So, and that's why I thought maybe a first step would just be have DBM do an inventory of what's out there, and then based on that inventory, then determine what's necessary.
Okay. Well, let's give it some serious thought as to whether there needs to be something that needs to be put in statute to standardize the process a little bit better. The final point then is, I think Delegate Arntz and also Delegate Smith had brought up the fact that, this is similar to a very large business, right? And you need to have good folks and accountants to be able to do the numbers here. Do you think we're paying the accountants at MDH enough to be able to attract the quality talent that we need in order to be able to do this? Because you cite the fact that certain accountants that are brought in, they have no understanding, and that's how your work papers become their manual.
We've had discussions internally again without any actual, some evidence. I think generally some of the employees in the executive branch are probably underpaid when you compare them to the University of Maryland system, where they can afford to get quality. They pay much more. They have other benefits like tuition remission and things like that. And so the University of Maryland, we have, I think, fewer findings on some of those audit reports. And perhaps that's based on the quality of the fiscal people that you can have when you pay them a good salary. So we have never done an audit or a study on that issue. We have done a compensation study a number of years ago, but that didn't go anywhere, where we showed the disparity in the salaries. I think Senator Stolfitz at the time, he took it we made the study to justify more salary for executive branch employees. And he said, well, gee, can't we reduce the University of Maryland salaries down to the state employee level? He went the wrong way with it. But nevertheless, we've never really formally studied that. So I can't have the cause and effect, but that's just something we've discussed internally.
Mhm. Okay, and the university has a smaller than $10 billion budget annually, so just something to keep in mind, and you do generally get what you pay for. So thank you. We're going to move on to the department. I want to thank Mr. Hook and your team for a lot of work, a very large team to all the effort that was put into this audit. We're going to invite up the Maryland Department of Health. We have the Secretary Laura Herrera-Scott, as well as Frederick Doggett, the Director of the Office of Internal Controls, the Audit Compliance and Information Security, and Matthew Otwell, the Chief Information Security Officer. I think we're just going to begin with Fred Doggett and Dr. Herrera-Scott first. And, you know, before we kick it off with their opening remarks, I want to make sure that we bear in mind that the years covered by this audit are from folks that are not at this table right now. And while they're here to answer questions and bear this responsibility currently to account for all the shortcomings in this report, a lot of this took place under folks that are not here at this table. And with that, we'll turn it over to Secretary Herrera-Scott.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Land, Chair Solomon, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today on the Office of Legislative Audits, Fiscal and Compliance Audits of the Office of the Secretary at the Maryland Department of Health. As was already mentioned, I'm Laura Herrera-Scott, Secretary of Health. And I want to acknowledge that the audit contains significant findings and highlights concerns around fiscal procedures, procurement practices, and cybersecurity controls, among others, at the Maryland Department of Health. We have prepared a presentation that walks through each of the findings that are not redacted for the public session today and the actions that the department is taking or has already taken to address each finding. I also want to acknowledge the severity of the findings as well as our commitment to addressing them. Though the period covered in the audit is prior to the current administration and prior to me joining the Department as Secretary, I commit to you that the work to address these findings and rebuild trust in the department is well underway. With regard to the findings related to fiscal controls and procedures, I want to first assure you that we have been closely consulting with the Department of Budget and Management, as well as an external accounting firm. At this time, we do not believe that the $1.1 billion deficit in the clearing account and remaining federal funds that need to be recouped that are highlighted by the Office of Legislative Audits represents the deficiency that will need to be collected or budgeted as part of fiscal year 2025 budget process. Our work with this external accounting firm is allowing for an unbiased look at reconciling funds in their clearing account highlighted by OLA, as well as helping our team with best practices for reconciliation moving forward. However, we do believe that the findings shared by OLA highlight the need for a comprehensive look at the department's fiscal procedures and compliance. Our annual budget with federal funds included is nearly $20 billion, and we need to ensure that we have the correct tools, procedures, and staffing models to ensure fiscal stewardship moving forward. We are working to identify an auditor who can make recommendations on this regard, and we will keep you informed of our progress on this effort. We've requested an emergency procurement through DGS, and we'll be working to identify a partner to help do what I just defined. With regard to procurement, the audit highlights very concerning practices. Since the audit period, the department has centralized procurement under one office and implemented new leadership to overhaul procurement procedures and policies, as well as continue to identify areas for improvement to ensure compliance with state law. Finally, with regard to cybersecurity, the department implemented a robust information security program that contains comprehensive policies, training, testing, and detection to protect against future cybersecurity threats. We will discuss our progress on this front in more detail, I guess, at a future date. I also want to thank the legislator auditors for their diligence in identifying these critical areas for improvement for the department. In closing, the Moore Miller administration is committed to service, transparency, accountable stewardship of taxpayer dollars, and compliance with the law. Addressing the impact of these audit findings will require both immediate and consequential action to create stability in these systems and rebuild trust in the long term. My leadership team is dedicated to improving processes within the department that will ultimately result in better services to Marylanders. So with that, I'll start with the slides. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this is an overview or a breakdown of the $1.4 billion. And I wanted to start with this as soon as it was called out in the audit, we started working closely with DBM as well as our external accountant. And as I already mentioned, we do not anticipate general funds will be needed to cover the discrepancy. We believe it's primarily an accounting and a reconciliation issue. And we are shooting for the end of FY24 closeout for all this to be resolved. As part of the FY22 closeout audit, OLA has already been mentioned, identified 16 samples in which they requested supporting documentation concerning federal fund revenue accruals totaling $3.4 billion. Of these test samples, 15 are associated with grant programs and 1 is associated with the Medicaid clearing account. Subsequent to the 22 closeout audit, OLA provided an update on the closeout audit findings in their recently released Office of the Secretary audit report. MDH provided OLA documentation in April 2023 supporting the prior attainment and subsequent allocation of $2.1 billion of the $3.5 billion tested in their closeout audit. These actions reduced the unreconciled amount from 3.5 to 1.4 amount shared in the most recent audit report that we're discussing today. In regards to the remaining 1.4, as of today, there is $243.7 million that has not yet been reconciled. 13.7 of the 243 outstanding pertains to unattained federal revenue. The remaining 230 has been received in our clearing account and will be fully allocated and reconciled by FY24 closeout. The 13.7 in unattained federal funds pertains to grants that have 2-year performance periods. As such, we anticipate full attainment prior to the end of the performance period as shown on the slide. Next slide. So we saw a similar slide from OLA on this, and it's just to explain our clearing accounts. When Medicaid submits the draw to the state treasurer's office, CHIP, money follows the person, and Medicaid funds are all in the same weekly draw. All revenue is received to the overall clearing account and is allocated from there. There are 3 sub-accounts that must be reconciled when revenue is received to properly allocate to the appropriate grant account. The reconciliations of the clearing account were not performed timely and transactions were miscoded. These issues with reconciliation resulted in the OLA closeout audit finding. We believe this was in part due to staff turnover, which you've heard before already. We have been working diligently with our partners at DBM and, as I said, contracted with a certified public accounting firm to implement OLA's recommended corrective actions. In addition, we are working with human resources to fill critical vacant fiscal positions. Our MDH fiscal staff and new director of fiscal services administration have been putting in many hours to bring this issue to full resolution as well as resolve the issue in the future. As our accounting practices and reconciliations become more complex, system modernization will be needed. Our current financial management systems presents major challenges when having to reconcile revenue and expenditure transactions processed through antiquated subsystems and cumbersome clearing account drawdown processes. For these reasons, we believe it is imperative to undertake a broader look at overall processes to ensure a strong fiscal stewardship moving forward. Next slide. Concerning what findings 1 through 4, these are associated with MDH's federal fund accounting process. These findings are directly related to the FY22 closeout audit finding and our July 21, 2023 response to the JCR report that details our corrective action plan to resolve the closeout audit finding. In January 2023, MDH partnered with the Audit Fiscal Compliance Unit within the Department of Budget and Management. We met weekly to review MDH's processes and procedures and develop a detailed corrective action plan that was detailed in our JCR response. Part of the corrective action plan included procuring resources from a certified public accounting firm to assist with research and reconciliations to clean up longstanding accruals. The firm was brought on board in August of 2023. In addition to a review of our current processes and procedures, the external accounting firm is updating and creating additional reconciliations to help support the federal fund accounting process. We are anticipating the additional analysis as well as the implementation of the new processes to be fully completed by the end of FY24. And just to clarify on that, they are not only looking at our standard operating procedures and making recommendations on whether or not they're strong enough, but they're also making recommendations on areas where we don't have standard operating procedures. We've also added to create desktops. So I can't remember who mentioned the response regarding the function, not the person, should have clarity on what responsibility goes with the function. So we are working on desktop procedures so that the function is clearly defined regardless of who sits in the role. Next slide. As I mentioned, our partnership with DBM was key to identifying that the department needed external to support to fully address audit findings 1 through 4. We continue to reconcile the $1.4 billion in the audit finding. And as we've already shared, the firm is assisting with reviewing our current processes and procedures and creating additional reconciliations to help support the federal fund accounting process. We are anticipating the additional analysis as well as the implementation of new processes by the end of fiscal year 2024. Next slide. So this is regarding finding 5 in regard to automated script. And through the support of the external accounting firm, updated standard operating procedures and processes for reconciliation and federal fund accounting will be documented and implemented. In doing so, the validity and collectability of year-end automated revenue entries can be verified. And I'm going to deviate from the script a little bit just to give a clinical analogy. Today, for anyone in this room that's ever had an EKG, many of the new EKGs the machine gives a reading, normal sinus rhythm, atrial fibrillation. But as clinicians, and certainly as a physician, it is our responsibility to read the EKG ourselves and then compare the EKG findings to the clinical, how the patient is presenting. And so that's how we're thinking about this automated script. Yes, it's running behind the scenes, but does the automated script make sense? What is the presentation and the actual spreadsheets of the budget? And then how do we reconcile that ourselves, given, again, back to the function that is our responsibility to make sure we are not just relying on an automated script and saying good to go without doing our own assessment. So want to just clarify that. Next slide. Findings 6 and 7, which relate to procurements and disbursements, are listed here. I want to ensure the committees that address these findings is one of my top priorities. I've made a number of changes in the Office of Contract Management and Procurement, which are detailed in the next slide. So reorganization of all procurement responsibilities into the Office of Contract Management and Procurement. Now, this work started before I got there. The office was centralized to enhance oversight of MDH procurement activities. The problem is that even though it was centralized, many of the functions were still run through the various different programs and units, which resulted in inefficiencies with timely procurement reporting and documentation practices. So every administration had their own processes, and even though the people had been named, the processes had not been centralized in a centralized function. So in August of this year, we changed the leadership, and in a few short months, we've achieved several significant milestones. We've created an intake portal of all procurement activities so that procurements can be tracked from start to finish, which will also allow us to review the timeline for procurement, contract, and processing. And I'm going to deviate again. We're not there yet, but what we're working to, and I'll use Domino's Pizza Tracker as, and I know it sounds funny, but When you order from Domino's, you know when the order came in, you know when your pizza's in the oven, you know when the pizza's out of the oven and getting boxed, you know when it's en route in delivery, and you also know it's on your door. That's the goal of how we're going to be tracking our procurements moving forward, including BPW and other checks that will be built into the system. But this intake portal is the first act that we've taken to start oversight of all our procurement processes. In addition, we're using updated templates, training videos, additional training opportunities for program staff, and the creation of an internal real-time procurement dashboard. And that's how we're monitoring internally. In addition, we're creating a customer service team. So there are varying levels of procurement proficiency. And so we want to make sure if you're having trouble or have questions on what the right path is, that there's also a customer service team to help guide and provide counsel to you as you go through your procurement process. As it relates to finding 6, we've taken a number of steps to determine the propriety of payments made to the contractor for COVID related purposes. And at my direction, we now have an internal team with audit and investigative skills that were appointed to conduct a detailed examination of selected invoices. For each invoice, the review team will determine whether amounts charged, including time charges for contract staff, were sufficiently documented and can be associated with specific assigned work or deliverables. The team obtained documentation from the contractor, including detailed timesheets and hourly changes in late September, and began work the first week of October. We anticipate that the review will be completed by the end of the calendar year. Members of the review team were not involved with the contract and will report findings directly to me. I will determine appropriate next steps based on the outcome of that review. Next slide. Oh, here we are. Finding 13, which pertains to account receivable, was largely born out of extraordinary circumstances related to the network security incident that took place in December 2021. The department's hospital management information system was not available for an 8-month period, which caused a delay in billing services rendered at MDH operated inpatient facilities. As such, the department was unable to seek reimbursement from responsible parties such as Medicare and other insurers. When the systems were brought back online, MDH resumed billing and completed all activities associated with the 8 months the system was inoperable. The corrective action for this finding is complete and no additional action is required at this time. Next slide. Findings 14 and 15 relate to payroll, and our response is detailed on this slide. The audit system also identified 2 findings related to payroll procedures and processing. In response, the MDH Office of Human Resources has worked to implement a comprehensive verification process along with a biweekly reconciliation process to ensure accuracy. MDH Office of Human Resources is continue to work on process improvement across HR that will prevent future findings. Next slide. For finding 16, MDH did not sufficiently control collections, including untimely endorsement and deposit of collections, a lack of independent verification that collections were deposited, and a failure to require a large payment to be submitted electronically. The department has implemented a procedure for restrictively endorsing collections immediately upon receipt and updated written procedures to reflect the recommendations and resumed independent deposit verification in July. We've also updated all policies and procedures for cash receipts. All corrective action was implemented by August of last year. Finally, the department will study the issue of requiring large payments to be submitted electronically. The use of electronic ACH transfer could complicate the reconciliations of expenditures to revenues. Next slide. The final finding relates to MDH executive oversight. Specifically, it notes the department did not ensure corrective actions were implemented for prior fiscal compliance audits, including those related to Medicaid, the Developmental Disabilities Administration, and the fiscal 22 closeout audit. As I mentioned previously, the department has engaged an outside accounting firm to assist with findings audit 1 through 5 and help the department adopt standard operating procedures that will help prevent similar findings in the future. Moreover, members of our team meet regularly with DBM to evaluate the corrective actions we are taking. Myself and members of the team are engaged in addressing these findings, including holding staff accountable for corrective actions. I have also empowered the Office of Internal Controls, Audit Compliance, and Information Security, Fred Doggett, to work across the agency to address the findings presented in this report. Myself and my staff work in close collaboration with Fred and his team to monitor agency progress in addressing and resolving audit findings. This level of collaboration and partnership is essential to ensure that our prior findings get resolved and that corrective actions are sustained to reduce the likelihood of audit findings in the future. And that concludes my formal remarks. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have at this time.
Mr. Doggett, do you have anything, or are you here for responses on?
I'm happy to take questions.
Okay. All right. I'll kick it off with two questions kind of up front. And thank you, Madam Secretary. You had a slide in here that showed the breakdown of the 1.4 billion. And it's my understanding that the slides only, the breakdown there is only referring to the 16 accounts that were actually sampled by OLA.
Correct.
What about the other accounts, which sounds like there may be hundreds of other accounts that were not sampled by OLA, and where did those stand?
So that's the reconciliation process that we're doing with the accountant that we've brought in. So that work is ongoing.
So does that mean the loss could be worse than 3.5 billion?
So at this time, we don't think there was a loss of 3.5 billion. We don't think the 3.5 billion was reconciled appropriately. And so that's the piece that we're working through now.
But how do you know that if you're still looking at those other hundreds of accounts?
So I can't speak in absolute in front of you today, and that's the work that's underway that we're hoping to have completed by the end of fiscal year closeout 2024.
Okay. So it could be better. It's possible it could be worse. You're still working through the process to figure that out.
At this point, again, to use a clinical, if I were giving you my impression today, I think it will be better, not worse. But again, do not want to speak in certainty until we finish the process, which is underway right now.
Okay. So just to be clear, that's only of the 16 accounts that were sampled.
Correct.
Right? Okay. And there are many more.
Correct.
Okay. Second question pertains to, I know they weren't cited in the audit, but I'm just going to cite them as Ernst & Young. And so we had been asking a lot of questions through the years since the start of the pandemic, when the prior secretary brought in Ernst & Young. We could never get a clear answer as to what the scope of work of those individuals were. And now fast forward to a couple of years and we see that it's what started as 7 employees ballooned to over 130 employees. And I'm still not sure what the state got out of all of the tens of millions that we spent on Ernst & Young. And so do you have any ability to show us any specific documentations on what those tasks were that the 100 or 130 or so employees were responsible for, and what they actually did for the state of Maryland?
So that's the work that's underway, and I'll let Fred take that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. You earlier today used the word opaque, and I think that's a fair word for this contract. We are digging through that now. I think OLA made some very important observations along the lines of what you just said, that it was very difficult to understand without the clear breakout of who was doing what on what task, and the clear expectations of how long that task was going to take, how much it was going to cost, and so on and so forth. We don't know at this point why so much money was spent, but we are going through staff from my office and staff from the Secretary's office who weren't involved at all. And I can say virtually no one at the department was involved in that contract, but we are going through invoice by invoice, and we've requested details from EY that were not available even when these folks were asking for it. So we've gotten more data, and it's a big job, but we're going through it, and we hope to have, I think we're either going to say that, yeah, there's plenty of documentation for what they did, or obviously, no, there's not. And I can't tell you which way it's going to go at this point.
So as of right now, several years later, and I presume that the contract with Ernst & Young has ceased, we have no idea what the state of Maryland receive from this $80+ million contract, because there's no proper documentation that we can point to now at this very moment that you're going back to try to account for over the last couple of years?
There are thousands of documents. Let me put that out there, that EY created during the course of this contract. And many of those were available to OLA. What OLA correctly pointed out was all of them were created by the contractor with very little evidence that we as a department understood and agreed with, and in fact had asked for the work that was being done. That's where the disconnect is, and that's where we're trying to go back and connect those dots. Yes, sir.
So you're saying that the department had asked for work product and other deliverables and never received that from Ernst & Young?
No, we, there's a lot of deliverables that were received throughout the contract, thousands of documents. What was missing, and again, thanks to OLA pointing this out, was that we couldn't directly tie the charges, the invoices, to specific work product. And more importantly, we couldn't identify who was asking for the work, and in what way they were asking for the work, and in what way they were evaluating the work once it was presented to us. What the previous administration would say, I believe, if they were here, is we got through COVID and we got through the security incident. That would be, I have heard them say that. But yeah, as to the specifics and whether it could have been done for half the price, we don't yet know.
Okay, so that's pretty disturbing. I think it sounds as though we were invoiced by Ernst & Young and we weren't sure what we were invoiced for, and we're still working through the documentation to figure out what they actually did for us.
Well, I'm just
Go
gonna
ahead.
jump.
Yeah.
So I certainly want to answer that question, right? Having not been here and have this flag. So we're doing this due diligence to figure out if we can recreate the history to understand what was done during the time period for the dollars that were spent.
Well, this sounds like an indictment of the prior administration and the secretary's responsibility to make sure that tens of millions of dollars, $80 million in this instance, was spent on personnel that the state received consistent invoices for over many years, that we're still not sure, and we're still trying to backtrack to figure out what Ernst & Young actually delivered to the state of Maryland. It's really a shame. We'll move on to questions. Senator Hester.
I was just gonna ask one more question while we're talking about Ernst & Young. I've remained concerned that when, the company that owned One Stop went bankrupt, E&Y bought that company. And then there was an emergency procurement earlier this summer by MDH to get Ernst & Young to review the Department of Nurse, the Board of Nursing.
Mhm.
So we paid Ernst & Young again this summer to do an emergency procurement to review the Board of Nursing. And it seems like there could have been a potential conflict of interest there if part of what they were looking at was One Stop.
So the Board of Nursing was a competitive procurement process, and Ernst & Young was the only entity to apply. And they were not looking, I mean, there might have been a conflict of interest, but for the bill outlined what we needed to look at, which was around the staffing model and policies and procedures. And given the timing of the deliverable, we felt comfortable moving forward because the scope was very narrow and consistent with what we had asked for in our RFP.
I was told it was an emergency procurement that went before the Board of Public Works.
That it was emergent.
Yes.
Yes, it was.
I thought you just said it was competitive.
Well,
Competitive
emergency procurement is still competitive.
Why do you think only one person applied?
I don't know.
It could be our terms and conditions of the contracts, perhaps?
Perhaps.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both for being here, and Delegate Charles, I will get to you in a minute. I had a couple of questions. First and foremost, and I'm assuming the answer is going to be yes on this one, but I just want to get it on the record. I believe the outside firm that you've contracted with on the accounting piece is Deloitte. We just get on the record, will you commit to turning every document that Deloitte produces for you all to the OLA team to make sure that we have independent review to make sure that all the numbers that we're getting reports on from you are verified by the audit team?
Sure, I mean, I think we've been transparent with everything we've been doing and tried to share everything we can share. So yes, I don't know how that works after, but happy to share whatever we have.
Okay, great. Well, that's really important. We just want to make sure that we've got sort of a belts and suspenders approach. And I guess that I do want to go back to, and I don't know if your team can answer this right now, because obviously you weren't here. The annual fiscal audits that Clifton Allen Larson does as the state auditor. Can you explain to me sort of what the process is when your agency finishes the year-end books for that outside entity for the state to then come in and review this on an annual basis?
Yes, so my office acts as the liaison with that auditor. We review the findings as they are developed. We do our same process that we do on any other audit, which is talk with the responsible administrations within the department and provide answers or provide corrective actions. I will say, as long as I've been in the department, which is since to correct the record, Mr. Chairman, since 2017, we've never had an audit from or a finding from that audit that's anywhere near the significance of what we're talking about today.
Can I just stop you for a second? How?
Great question. And what I want to know, and that audit team is beginning its work now for the current year. They certainly know about the work that OLE has done. So I look forward to discussing with them what its relevance to their work and what steps they may have in the upcoming audit to take a look at the work that OLE has done.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to the conversation we were having earlier, absent obviously individual staff people, and most of the folks who were engaged in this obviously aren't here anymore at the senior level. How are we paying another accounting firm to essentially audit our books at the end of the year, and they miss this? I mean, this wasn't like 50 million here or there and a $30 billion budget. This was dramatic. So I think honestly, one of the things that I want to see, and I think our committee probably wants to see, is that follow-up conversation with Clifton Allen Larson to understand how they missed it, because they're still our firm. So I appreciate that. I do, Madam Secretary, just want to move to some of the personnel issues. My other capacity, I serve as the personnel chair, and I know, again, this has been one of the governor's top priorities. This is, the Speaker and the Senate President's top priority to fill the gaps and really restore our state government to what it needs to be to function appropriately, because clearly, an investment in staff pays off billions in dividends, or not losing our funding. Can you talk about, so in this audit report, it says that your vacancy rate at the executive level is still 13%. The spending affordability committee report that we got had the agency's overall vacancy rate at about 11% as of October, but obviously that was agency wide. What is the vacancy rate at the secretariat level in your sort of senior branch?
So I want to just give you overall, and then I'll talk about specifically for my office of the secretary. So when we first got there, it was almost 15%. It was 14+%, and in some areas almost. So
it got even worse.
Well,
than,
MDH wide.
Yeah.
I'm talking MDH wide, inclusive of our facilities, and in some areas it was 20% plus. And over the last 9+ months, because of the diligence that we've been doing on workforce, including retaining who we have and changing the culture around the importance of every single person that's contributing to the work that we do every day, and making sure they feel valued. So it was a retention strategy, but then it was also hiring strategy. And we don't have talent managers like private companies do, but how do we become those talent managers to bring the best of the best? And we've been pretty successful at doing that. Our vacancy factor is 11.3% right now. I think it's the last number that I checked on the most recent report. I will say I am Office of the Secretary carrying a higher vacancy factor because I have a handful of positions that I've been holding for strategic hires based on certain initiatives that we're trying to roll out in 2024. So my vacancy factor in the Office of the Secretary is a result of me. So that's why it's running higher, because the N is smaller in the Office of the Secretary. And if I keep 4 or 5 positions open, it just makes the percentage look higher than the rest of the department. But those are being kept open intentionally looking for the right people to fill key positions in the department.
Do you feel like?
Not related to finance. I want to clarify
Yeah.
that. The finance positions have all been posted and hired.
Okay,
Or
well, so
They
that,
all haven't been hired. For instance, we just had our behavioral health CFO who committed, and then a week before start date got a counteroffer from the company she was with or the agency she was with and rescinded her acceptance. So we're having issues like that.
well, that was gonna be my next question. Are there still vacancies within the finance?
Yes.
How many?
I don't-
Ballpark?
5 or 6. 5 or 6.
Okay. And then to the point that was touched on earlier with the audit team, do you feel like you have the salaries to, I mean, I did wasn't comprehensive research, I will openly admit that, but the average salary for CFO in the state of Maryland is somewhere around $450,000. Obviously that includes, for-profit companies, and I think if you were to go down even, deputies and other fiscal officers, you're looking at, a significant amount of money. Again, this is an agency that has a tremendous budget. Do you feel like you have the salaries to be competitive, to hire the people you need to hire for these positions at all levels?
So we have challenges based on what we can offer people for the different roles we have in the department. And even to the staffing model that we have, as I mentioned, given the size of the organization and the size of the budget when we're working on the RFP now. But our hope is that whoever we bring in to look at, not just to your point, what happened related to the OLA audit, but our financing structure policies writ large. We're also going to be looking at our staffing model. How many people should we have compared to what we actually have? And I don't have the answer to that.
Okay. Again, I know it's a top priority. It's not cheap. We need high quality staff, not only in your agency, but in every other agency. The vacancy rates obviously have come down, in the last 9 months, 9 or 10 months, but they need to come down a lot further, and that's not cheap. We at the state should not be the farm team for our county governments and for the federal government and for the private sector. And you need the resources to be able to hire the good people so that we don't have these problems going forward. The last question that I did want to ask, just on the procurement piece, to piggyback a little bit off of Senator Lamb, has Ernst & Young been helpful in turning over the documents that you need?
Yes, absolutely. I think what we had asked for, it was OLA's idea, and it had never been asked for before, which is a detailed breakdown of what hours were spent on what task.
Were they accountable for providing that, or is there language in the contract that they signed that they were accountable for providing that in real time during the contract?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
We'll find out.
Have there been changes to, was the contract that was signed with Ernst & Young earlier this summer different than the contract that was signed with Ernst & Young under this procurement? Have we changed anything with it?
The Board of Nursing
Yeah.
contract, it was a much, much, much smaller contract, and it was specifically targeted to the items that were identified in the statute that passed, and only those things.
I guess maybe let me clarify that. I don't mean sort of on the scope of work. I mean in sort of the oversight pieces of it, so we don't have a repeat of.
So the oversight was very tightly managed because we had a very, very, very short deliverable. So we were meeting regularly with the Board of Nursing and with the Chief of Staff, Erin McMullen, who's over to my left. But that was a pretty regular cadence because we had such a short window to get the report out.
Okay. Well, I would just echo again Senator Lamb's comments. I am very curious to see what comes out in December after you all have done your deep dive with them, because I want to make sure if Ernst & Young is accountable for something that they didn't do, that as we continue to sign contracts with them, that we can hold them accountable on that, because $80 million is not a small sum of money. So I appreciate you being here and your answers, and I'm going to turn it over to Delegate Charles now. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I got a couple of questions in terms of procurement. For the first one, I'm kind of want to understand what your threshold is before you have to send any procurements over to the Office of State Procurement for MDH.
I think it's 50,000 is the cutoff. I will just go one step further aside from the procurement. So the other thing, under the prior leadership, the deputy secretaries had a lot of autonomy to sign things outside of the secretary's signature. And when I first came over, I stopped all that, everything, even if it was $1,000, I had to sign it because I wanted to see all the money that was flowing through the agencies and the kinds of things that we were authorizing, either through a formal procurement, through a grant, through an interagency agreement. So the threshold is set, I think is it $50,000 or 150,000? So 50,000, but even before that, when I got there, stopped everything that had been delegated outside the secretary, had pulled that all back so I could see what was going through the administration and the processes to approve certain things or not.
Okay. So 50,000 is the threshold. Then I see you created this intake portal, MDH's intake portal. Can you explain a little bit more about what that portal is and how it coalesces with email and marketplace advantage?
So unfortunately, our new procurement lead couldn't join us today, so I can't answer how it aligns with e-marketplace. But what was happening is the procurements were coming in through all different avenues, and there was no one place. It was multiple spreadsheets for trying to figure out where a particular procurement was. In addition, there was no, at least seemingly, prioritization based on either dollar amount, urgency, the problem we were trying to solve with the procurement. So this intake process helps triage the procurements now moving forward. It's also one place where we can look for all the procurements that are pending and where they are and what status they're in.
Yeah, I know across the entire state, all of the agencies are supposed to utilize email and marketplace advantage. And so I'm just a little concerned and wondering, with this intake portal that you created, which I think is good for an internal process for you guys to be able to understand what's happening procurement wise. When you guys reach that $50,000 threshold, which sounds like a lot of these contracts, millions of dollars, they fell out of your scope and supposed to go directly to the Office of State Procurement to get these awards out. You know, trying to really grasp, how you guys plan to fix that. And I see the great work that you plan to do for fixing procurement, but a lot of things get lost if we're all over the place. By not having these things go through the proper channels like they're supposed to through the Office of State Procurement, since you guys are only at the $50,000 threshold and not necessarily using Emma.
Well, I'm not implying that we're not doing that. I just can't speak to it right now. I will tell you that the person who's running a procurement right now is a lawyer, so she's well versed on all the rules around procurement, and the structure that she's put in place is to make sure that we are following the rules. So if I can take the specific question, and I don't know if this is how it's done on the marketplace, for the record, and get back to you with a written response, because I don't want to misspeak on how her intake process and the intake process she's built for the department, how that feeds into the marketplace. I just don't know the answer for you right now.
Okay, now I'll definitely be waiting to get an answer from you guys on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Charles. And yeah, I know, again, we're limited in our time based on space constraints. So if we have follow-up questions, we'll send it to your team and appreciate you all getting back to us.
Okay.
Delegate Blankovich-Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here and all the information you've provided on the steps the department's taken under your leadership for this mess that you inherited. I was hoping that you could just briefly elaborate on a point that you made in your prepared testimony about the antiquated technology system that was one of the contributing factors. Do you know how old that system is, and if the prior administration had ever undertaken any study or made recommendations about updating that? And then if you could talk about next steps and what a potential time frame might be.
I would say we have systems that might go back to the 90s. And it's not just our decision on updating. I think that's a broader discussion. I've certainly have heard Controller Learman talk about the need for updated systems. So I don't have a plan specifically on what that looks like, but recognize that we have very old systems, and certainly the number of grants and the amount of money flowing through not only our agency but other agencies that use these systems makes it harder and harder to reconcile these accounts. That in no way, shape is an excuse, right? We own what we own and we're gonna fix it moving forward. It just makes it harder and more cumbersome. That didn't exactly answer your question, is because I don't know, since, yeah, they're old though.
You, Delegate Blakovich-Carr, any other questions from House members?
So I have a follow-up question on kind of the procurement process, because I had legislation a couple of years ago to put some better guardrails around emergency procurements. And I think we've tried, because of some of the emergency procurements that we saw related to COVID, particularly with the South Korean tests, ventilators that were procured but never showed up, and COVID tests that were procured through folks that never had any experience, PPEs rather, that were procured through companies that had no prior experience in procuring medical equipment. Do you feel that the provisions that you had included in the slide deck will help preclude the situation with Ernst & Young from ever happening again? Because some of this is a management and lack of oversight issue, I think, from leadership at the department. That this contract was allowed to start with 7 people, of which we asked consistently for a scope of work that was never produced. And then through multiple instances was asked to be expanded with the approval of the Board of Public Works, but in a fashion that still is not clear to us to this very day exactly what they produced. Do you think the recommendations you have in here would prevent that from happening again in the future?
So that's my hope. Certainly not only the recommendations, but I think back to the culture that we're trying to build in the organization and the level of accountability at the deputy secretary and even at the director level, and the expectations for each of the people that are trying to do whatever it is that they're trying to do, to make sure that when they ask for procurement or ask for anything, that we are following the rules of that thing that we're trying to do. And, you know, scope creep, for lack of a better description, that you can't just piggyback on things anymore. And we have certainly instituted that culture, and we're certainly in the process that we built in procurement, flagging things and kicking things back to the owners to say, you can't do it, not this way. It's got to be a full procurement, or it's got to be done this way. Like I said, we're looking at everything, including our interagency agreements and our granting process. Everything's on the table right now.
And how, because you're within the first year in this role, we all obviously as a legislative body have a responsibility for oversight and making sure that the departments are doing what they're supposed to be doing with the budget that we provide. From your perspective, was there any way that we could have known sooner or been able to get clearer answers out of the department from your predecessors that would have given us an indication that this contract was ballooning in a way that seemed unjustifiable? Is there anything that we could have asked for sooner or looked at sooner or reached out to the department for? And I understand that, you know, folks that were there before were not very forthcoming with information. In fact, probably very misleading in how they were answering some of these questions about this contract. But with a fresh set of eyes with you coming in and your team, what do you think we could have asked for or done sooner to be able to get a grasp around this problem?
So I think you asked all the right questions. I just think, to your point, you weren't given the right answers.
Okay. So, and I think many of us on this committee felt that way too. So I've chaired this committee for the last few years, and I think we were being provided very misleading answers by individuals that didn't want us to have a proper view of everything that was going on with that contract. And I don't know what the motivations are. You know, and I think it certainly is very concerning. And I think that's why we do still want to know what the state got out of this contract so that we can better understand, one, what may have been those motivations, why this contract expanded so quickly, as well as being able to identify any additional measures in the future that we can help get our hands around this problem sooner.
I actually just had one more question as well on the procurement contract, and maybe I'll add this to the list of things that I'd love to see in that December report, not to give you more homework, but in some of the conversations that we've had with OLA, it does seem like some of the work that was done, particularly later on, as that scope expanded, were sort of the things that you would expect regular staff to do. It's one thing when you're talking about an emergency procurement during COVID to, hire within a week, 300 staff or whatever to do vaccinations, right? That is something that clearly there was an immediate need. But when you're talking about systemic work that could be done by in-house staff, and I know, again, this administration has done great work over the last 10 months to try to change the contractual pins or the contractual positions to actual pins. And so I would be very curious to see what, if any, of the work that was done, again, in the later stages of that contract should have been done or could have been done by in-house staff if we actually had the capacity to hire and retain quality people. Because again, I think, looking at what, at least the information that we have, this again goes to the previous administration's interest in continually contracting out to private companies to do work that frankly we should be doing in-house with state employees who want to work and believe in the mission of what our state government is, not for-profit companies that are charging a lot more, frankly, than what we should be spending on state employees. So I would really love to see if you get a breakdown, or if you could break that out for us, that would be really helpful.
Fair question, Mr. Chairman.
Last call on the House side for any other questions. All right, thank you.
All right. I think in interest of time, we had discussed the potential of moving the cyber findings that would be handled in closed session to the December hearing, just because we do need to be able to step out of this room around 11:30. And so we're going to hold that for December. I want to thank the Secretary and her staff and team for being here. Obviously, a very challenging audit that we're going to still pay very close attention to. I know the folks from OLA will continue their work because there are some repeat findings and obviously some significant new findings as well that need to be followed up upon, and anticipate that you'll be in the department so far has been fully cooperative with OLA, and hope that will continue as well in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think if you want to step down from the witness table, we'll call Mr. Hook and his team back up to deal with one additional agenda item before we adjourn for this morning.
Well, it's actually just me.
Just you. All right. Well, I know you have a team. So, so we have Mr. Hook from the Office of Legislative Audits. This is to deal with the summary of reports issued and recommended committee action.
Yes, you have a small handout. We do this every hearing, and it just summarizes the number of reports issued since our last hearing. And this document on page 1 shows we issued 47 audit reports between December 1st, 2022 and October 31st, 2023. And we are recommending 2 of those audits or for hearings or for action. One of them is this audit that we just talked about today. We wanted to have a hearing, which we just completed. And the other recommended action was the Maryland State Department of Education. And you do have a handout, a separate handout that has some confidential information in it that summarizes some of the elements of that audit report. And what I would request of the committee is a letter of concern be sent from the committee to the Maryland State Department of Education. And the reason I want that, or I would request that, is that there were several findings in that audit report where we were critical of the State Department of Education's monitoring of state funding to local school systems. And so we had taken several findings, including the Blueprint for Maryland funds, and we had asked them to establish some type of methodology to ensure that the local school systems were spending money correctly and actually also follow up on our audit reports, because we only audit them once every 6 years, the local school system. So it's not very frequent. And we were having repeat audit findings in those school system audits. So we thought that MSDE through their audit arm could also monitor that. Initially, in their response to the audit report, they agreed. And then 2 months later, they sent a letter to certain legislative leaders. I did not get a copy of this letter directly from them, where they decided to disagree with those findings on monitoring the LEAs and disagreed with the findings and the recommendations. So I would just ask for a letter of concern clarifying that a new interim superintendent, I guess it is now, is she would be agreeable to re-agreeing with those findings to monitor the local school systems for some financial elements.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. Thank you for bringing that up. So I was one of the folks who did receive
You
that
gave me the
letter.
copy, I believe. Yes.
Oh, well, thank you for reminding me. We get a lot of letters.
Well, yes.
And I did find that letter pretty disturbing because just to be clear, local education agencies are an extension of the state. And so we as state legislature have a responsibility to also make sure that those funds are being properly utilized. And it's pretty striking to me when we look at the number of repeat audit findings in our LEAs across the state. There are more repeat audit findings in LEAs here in the state than in all the departments at the cabinet level put together. You think about that for 1 second. There are more repeat audit findings in all of the LEAs put together in the school systems across the state than the departments put together. And so there is a real issue here that I think we do need to take very seriously. And I don't know if MSD is listening, but I think this letter is a good start to make sure that we hold them accountable for this as well. I think it is really irresponsible of MSDE to kind of throw their hands up in the air and say that we don't have a responsibility to make sure that LEAs deal with these repeat findings. And I think that's what your letter is getting to.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add, I want to say thank you, because I think the blueprint is probably one of the most significant pieces of legislation that I think we've passed in the last decade, certainly since I've been here. And if we are not ensuring that that funding is being used appropriately, the whole thing falls apart. And so I could not agree with the co-chair's comments anymore. We need to make sure that that money's going to the right place, and that if it's not, somebody in MSD is holding those LEAs accountable for fixing it.
And one final thing, I will just say that on the list of reports issued, there was a report issued in March, Maryland Transportation Authority, data analysis of electronic tolling and customer service processes. We had hoped to have that review covered today at this hearing. That was my intent, but there was a sad, untimely death of the director of the Transportation Authority. So that was pulled, and although it's not indicated on this document, if time permits, and I will talk to the co-chairs about possibly scheduling that for the December hearing.
Certainly, yes, we're open to doing that. And so I think, seeing no objections to the committee, if you want to proceed with that letter, please do so. It is an issue that we want to stay on top of. I've asked the department, MSDE, for an update. And, I think we were told that with all the leadership changes occurring at MSD, that they wanted to get back to us on that. But depending on their response to your letter, it may be something that we still consider for legislation for this coming session to address and make sure that LEAs are held accountable for these repeat audit findings. So
well, the letter actually comes from the committee, the force of the committee, okay. And Eric actually drafts it. I just wanted to clarify that key point.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. Senator Hellman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hearken back to my days on the Appropriations Committee when we changed the frequency of those audits to 6 years from, I think it was 4 years. It may have even been less than that, but is that something that you would want to revisit again? Is giving you the opportunity to do them more frequently?
I never should have said anything. I don't know why. I never should have brought it up. No, a 6 is fine. And actually, some of them actually received waivers for 12 years. Some of the Eastern Shore school systems. So we haven't been back in 12 years. But I think, some of the school systems have internal auditors, some have county auditors who try to get access in there, and the State Department of Education can get in there. So, and they have also CPAs coming in every year to do their financial statements. But frankly, I'm comfortable with 6 until after I retire, and then you can revisit that if you'd like.
Delegate Johnson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I was going to piggyback on Senator Hellman. That was my question. And like you said, they can get a waiver. So I just don't know if every 12 years is adequate.
Right.
Yeah, it was I think there were 5 or 6 that received the waiver, and the way to get a waiver, it's required the Senate delegation from that jurisdiction, the House delegation, the local school board, and whoever the governing local government is, either the commissioners or a county council or something, all collectively have to agree to request a waiver. And then I think if they do, I believe, actually the Joint Audit Committee, I think, is the one that has to approve it. And I think it's automatic that once those parties all agree. So it's kind of a local control issue regarding granting the waivers. And I do know that one county that did request and receive a waiver then withdrew it after the fact. And then we did go and audit them every 6.
Well, we've kind of seen how no oversight has worked with the Department of Health. So we don't want to create our own mess, another one like that. So maybe that's something we need to talk about, especially with repeat findings.
It could be, but it would probably, I hate to say this, but we'd probably need some more resources if we were to go more frequently, because when we started those school system audits 20 some years ago, I believe we received approximately 15 positions or so to do that, because it was quite an undertaking. If you can imagine, the first 2 we did were Baltimore City and Prince George's County, and they were monstrous. So it does take some resources to do that. So if we were to have a more frequent cycle, we would probably need a couple more positions.
Do you know what year we went to the 6 year?
Actually, I think it was always 6 for some reason.
I thought it was less. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Johnson. And I will say, I think, I don't want to say that MSD was exactly the same position as what we just heard on MDH, but I remember when we received some of that information, they sent an interim report. We had a work group, at least on the House side, on some of the blueprint pieces as it related to virtual education during COVID. And I remember we got a report back that said, yeah, we've heard from some school systems and they're not spending their money in the right place. And we asked MSD, what are you doing about it? And they just sort of shrugged it off. So, I mean, again, it's hard for us to do the oversight role when the agencies are not doing it appropriately. And, I think that goes to leadership and the state board. So that I think that's a much longer conversation. But Delegate Arons, go ahead.
Real briefly, are we able to do a line item audit on the schools?
You mean to go into a special focused review?
Yeah.
I believe the law does allow for that. If the presiding officers or the Joint Audit Committee request, I believe we can go in at any time and look at any particular element of the school system.
Can the county order that also?
No, I don't think so. They mean county order me to go in?
Well, can the county order them to do that on their side of it?
Oh, sure. Again, I'm not so sure. Those school boards are very autonomous. And they kind of fight oversight sometimes from the locals. So I'm not so sure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Arons. Delegate Watson.
Follow up on that. Remind us how often the counties and the local jurisdictions are required to be audited.
We don't audit we don't audit the counties themselves at all.
Okay.
They have annual financial audits.
Yes.
Similar to what the state undergoes, but we do not audit them. What we do is we do a review every year, a desk review. All the local jurisdictions in the state of Maryland, including the counties and local taxing districts, they have to send in their financial statements to us and also fill out certain financial forms for the Department of Legislative Services. And then we do a desk review to make sure that the statements or the audits appear to be conducted appropriately. And we actually issue a special review to the Joint Committee on the Management of Public Funds. I think there's a hearing every fall.
Yes.
And we make a presentation
Yes.
of the results of that work. But
Yes.
we do not audit them.
But
It's a
that is
desk review.
every couple of years.
That's every year we do that.
Okay.
That's every year, because every year they have to follow their financial
And
statements.
they have the ability to ask for waivers and.
They do, it's
have
usually the very small entities.
Findings, they have findings and sometimes they repeat findings.
Sometimes they do, yeah, collateralization, things like that. Yes, correct.
That's
And
annually.
the waivers, which I can grant per the law, it's for very, very small dollar amounts. We're very tiny entities.
Okay. We're about ready to be kicked out, but before we adjourn, I want to say that we also have legislation that's pending. This speaks to Mr. Hook's issue with bandwidth. There's actually legislation that we're going to introduce this coming session to reduce some of the liquor board audit frequencies or be able to have outside auditors come in and help with that. That will help free up bandwidth for other audits to take place. And so, you know, when it comes to that, keep that in mind for legislation that's coming this session because, you know, bandwidth is a limited resource there at the Office of Legislative Audits. Thank you, Mr. Hook, to you and your team. A lot of folks involved in the MDH audit. We certainly appreciate all of your hard work as well. Thank you to the department for being here. We are adjourned until December. Thank you.
Thank you.